Every meal you eat depends on a fuel source most people never think about. Not electricity, not gasoline. Cooking gas, the thermal energy that turns raw ingredients into food your body can actually use. And right now, that fuel supply sits on the edge of a knife, because 6 separate crises between 2000 and 2026 have each proven the same thing. The global food system runs on imported fossil fuels, and when those imports stop, restaurants close, families go hungry, and entire nations watch their nutrition collapse in real time. That sounds extreme. What makes it worse is that every single one of those crises was predictable, and nobody built the infrastructure to prevent the next one. Cooking gas markets at the turn of the millennium looked nothing like they do today. Between 2000 and 2020, total energy supply across the ASEAN region grew by more than 80%, natural gas demand doubled, and fossil fuels drove over 90% of that expansion. Governments across the global south understood that relying on wood, charcoal, and agricultural waste for cooking kept billions trapped in poverty and poor health, which is why 2020 estimates pinned the cooking sector at 1.69 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions, with 77% of that coming from non-renewable biomass. Indonesia launched the most ambitious fix in 2007, a mega project to shift over 50 million households from subsidized kerosene to LPG in 5 years. Distribution numbers looked spectacular. What the data revealed afterward told a different story, a behavioral pattern called fuel stacking. Wealthier suburban households captured most of the benefits. Poorer families never fully abandoned biomass. Instead of climbing a clean energy ladder, they stacked fuels, using LPG for quick, low-energy tasks like boiling water, and then falling back to wood or electricity when meals demanded extended cooking time. Cooking fuel choice turned out to be deeply elastic, moving up and down with affordability and the specific thermal needs of local diets. The first collision. And that's when the first big collision arrived. Between January 2004 and May 2008, rice prices exploded by 224%, wheat climbed 108%, and corn rose 89%, all driven by crude oil costs that inflated agricultural production, fertilizer, and transport, compounded by the diversion of food crops into biofuel. Median headline inflation in low-income countries reached 12.7% by mid-2008. According to the IMF, food prices in the poorest nations jumped 17%, and fuel inflation hit 19.5%. Those price shocks didn't fade quickly either. Analysis showed they passed through to consumers asymmetrically, reaching maximum impact roughly 12 months after the initial spike. Restaurants absorbed the hit directly. Out of 9,500 U.S. operators surveyed, 388, or 4.1%, closed permanently in 2008. Bennigan's filed for bankruptcy. Sit-down restaurant visits dropped from 20% of adults on any given day in 2006 down to 17% by 2011, according to the American Time Use Survey. But fast food traffic barely moved, holding steady at 13%. Diners didn't stop spending on food outside the home. They traded down, hard, to cheaper formats. Southeast Asian governments faced the bill next. Thailand started raising the fixed LPG price of 18.13 baht per kilogram in September 2013, aiming for 24.82 baht by late 2014, an increase of 50 satang per kilogram each month. Analysts at the time pointed out that cooking gas hikes rippled through the economy more harshly than electricity or road toll increases, because LPG price increases push up the cost of every prepared meal in the country, landing squarely on low-income households. Indonesia wrestled with similar reforms between 2013 and 2015, managing to generate fiscal savings while trying not to crush the poor. None of those structural weaknesses mattered for a while, because oil prices fell off a cliff between 2014 and 2016, dropping by roughly 70%. U.S. import crude petroleum collapsed 51.7% between June 2014 and January 2015 alone, and that cheap energy let the restaurant industry boom without consequence. Operators kept building their businesses around imported gas, with no strategic reserves and no backup infrastructure. The problem wasn't gone, it was hiding. The 2022 meltdown. February 2022 blew the cover off entirely. Russia invaded Ukraine. The EU scrambled to replace Russian pipeline gas, and European buyers absorbed massive LNG volumes from the global spot market. Storage mandates pushed EU facilities to 90% capacity by November. Voluntary demand cuts hit 15%, and the Dutch TTF benchmark gas price quadrupled, from a 5-year pre-COVID average of 17.5 euros per megawatt hour to roughly 70 euros. U.S. Henry Hub gas rose only 50% by comparison, which shows how concentrated the damage was in Europe. And Europe could afford to absorb it, the rest of the world could not. Myanmar, a country that had just started importing LNG in 2020 to power Yangon, abandoned all imports by 2022 because the price was simply impossible. Sri Lanka's energy crisis stacked on top of a sovereign debt default, producing the worst economic meltdown since its independence in 1948. Food inflation reached an astounding 94% by August 2022. According to the World Food Programme, 6.3 million Sri Lankans, more than 30% of the entire population, became food insecure. Over 5.3 million people cut meals or skipped eating altogether, and 60% of families shifted to cheaper, less nutritious food for one simple reason: they didn't have enough cooking gas to prepare anything else. Smart meter data from Nairobi's Mukuru settlement painted an even sharper picture. When food prices climbed over 15% because of the war's disruption to global maize and fertilizer supplies, residents slashed their pay-as-you-go LPG spending by 80%, which translated to a 2/3 drop in per capita gas consumption. 3 out of 4 households overhauled their cooking habits entirely. Half started skipping meals. Nearly 2/3 switched to cheaper foods, cutting way back on meat, fish, and fuel-heavy staples like ugali. Over in Brisbane, Australia, the cost of eating healthy surged 17.9%, while unhealthy diets rose only 11.9%. And by 2022, welfare-dependent households needed to spend 37.7% of their disposable income just to afford a healthy diet, well past the 30% threshold where nutritionists classify food as unaffordable. The 2026 Strait of Hormuz blockade. All of that, the 2008 crisis, the subsidy battles, the 2022 meltdown, every one of those events was dwarfed by 2026. Military strikes against Iran triggered a near-complete blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a chokepoint that carries 20 million barrels of oil per day, along with the majority of the world's LPG and LNG shipments. Intelligence assessments called it the largest oil and gas disruption in history, bigger than the Suez Crisis. India's exposure was devastating. Roughly 62% of the country's annual LPG consumption, about 31.3 million tons, travels through that strait, somewhere between 85 and 90% of total imports. Crude oil reserves sat at 60 days, but LPG stock covered only 25 to 30 days, and LNG just 10. The government triggered the Essential Commodities Act, prioritizing households above every other sector. Refineries dropped to 80% allocation, petrochemical plants to 70%, and commercial food service took a brutal 35% supply cut. Oil marketing companies stopped dispatching 19-kilogram commercial cylinders across entire regions. Black market prices for those commercial cylinders jumped from 1,700 rupees to 2,300. With 60 to 65% of restaurant cooking infrastructure locked into LPG, and most operators carrying less than a week of gas, the industry hit a wall. Mumbai saw warnings that nearly half its restaurant chains could temporarily shut down. One prominent Chennai hotel posted a notice declaring a holiday because it had no gas. The Delhi High Court lawyer's canteen stopped serving main courses, offering only sandwiches and cold salads. Jubilant Foodworks, Devyani International, Sapphire Foods, and Westlife Food World all faced operational crisis as cylinder inventory dropped below 1 week. Zomato and Swiggy reported order volumes crashing by 50 to 60% as partner kitchens went dark, which meant delivery workers saw their daily runs fall from 30 to just 5, plunging gig workers' families into debt. The disaster went deeper still, because India's estimated 100 million migrant workers depend entirely on dabas and street vendors for their daily calories, having no private kitchens, and the 35% commercial gas cut forced those vendors to shut their stalls. Wartime cooking. What the restaurant industry deployed in response was a survival strategy borrowed from wartime. The National Restaurant Association of India pushed emergency advisories across Mumbai, Pune, Bangalore, Hyderabad, and Delhi NCR, echoing the rationing playbooks of World War I and II. Kitchens were told to stop deep frying and slow cooking immediately, pre-soak grains and legumes to cut active cooking time, consolidate into large batch cooking sessions, and shift as much cooking as possible to induction cooktops and electric griddles. Pune's appliance retailers on Laxmi Road and in Hadapsar watched induction cooktops go from slow-moving inventory to the hottest product in the store overnight. Blinkit and Zepto listed them as sold out. Families adapted in a very specific way, using induction for boiling milk and making tea, while hoarding whatever LPG they had left for dishes that absolutely require open flame, things like rotis and dosas. Why restaurants collapse so fast? The financial math behind these shutdowns explains why restaurants collapse so fast. A restaurant burns 263,000 BTU per square foot, nearly 4 times what an average commercial space uses. High-volume quick-service operations push that to 10 times the average, consuming $20 of energy per square foot compared to $2 for an office building. Cooking devours 40% of all that energy. Food costs, labor, and overhead each eat about a third of revenue, which leaves pre-tax margins somewhere between 2 and 9%, with small independents squeezed into the 2 to 6% range and chains sitting at 6 to 9%. 16 days. That is the average cash runway for a restaurant, compared to 47 days for real estate and 32 for manufacturing. During the South India LPG shortage, industry groups warned that up to 60% of independents face shutdown within 2 to 3 days, and actual closures hit 20% in major metro areas within the first week. For small operators, extending past 30 days of shortage means a near 50% chance of never reopening. Chains survive through access to corporate credit and EBITDA margins that can reach 18%, letting them reroute prep to electric-powered ghost kitchens. Hospitals and schools cannot close. They are legally obligated to keep feeding people, which means they switch to pre-cooked processed meals and MRE-style distribution, keeping calories flowing at the expense of nutritional quality. Switching to induction makes thermodynamic sense, 85 to 90% efficiency versus gas at a meager 31%. A gas range pulling 35,000 BTU per hour delivers only 10,850 BTU of effective cooking power, while a 3,500-watt induction unit delivers 3,010 watts at 86% efficiency and costs $720 per year to run, compared to $1,240 for gas. The barrier is upfront investment, somewhere between $15,000 and $35,000 for equipment alone, with total kitchen conversions stretching to $250,000. Biomass costs almost nothing to start, but cripples throughput, since 1 kilogram of LPG delivers the cooking equivalent of 2.5 kilograms of charcoal, or as much as 29.7 kilograms of raw wood. Recovery and dietary damage. Recovery timelines from these shocks stretch out far longer than most people realize. After 2008, spending on food away from home dropped 18%, and the U.S. restaurant industry needed until 2016 to reach pre-recession levels, an 11-year slog. Sri Lanka's economy contracted 7.3% in 2022 and bounced back to 5% growth by 2024, but only after absorbing $2.9 billion in IMF bailouts and forcing deep structural change. What may be the most damaging consequence of all is what happens to people's diets. When cooking gas becomes too expensive, households migrate toward ultra-processed foods that need zero thermal energy. Things like instant noodles, frozen pizzas, and packaged snacks loaded with sweeteners, emulsifiers, and preservatives. A 2023 study from Montpellier, France, found that once you account for the labor cost of cooking, industrially processed dishes come out 5.34 euros cheaper per 4 portions than homemade equivalents, which is exactly why 54% of American at-home calories came from UPFs by 2018, while unprocessed food dropped to just 30%. The Lancet has flagged that UPF consumption drives an average of 500 extra kilocalories per day and correlates with obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease over time. And here sits the paradox that nobody has solved. 3 billion people still cook with solid biomass, wood and dung and coal, producing respiratory damage that hits women and girls hardest. And studies in China tied domestic coal use directly to elevated lung cancer rates among females. GAB is supposed to be the solution, but every price spike sends the poor back to burning biomass. Meanwhile, in the developed world, research from the Rocky Mountain Institute found that gas stove combustion releases nitrogen dioxide indoors, and a meta-analysis linked 13% of U.S. childhood asthma cases to gas stove exposure, which puts it on par with secondhand smoke as a health risk. Indonesia at the center. Indonesia sits at the center of all these pressures. 84% of families cook with LPG. The 2024 budget set aside 87.4 trillion rupiah for 3 kilogram cylinder subsidies, kept at 5,000 rupiah per kilogram since 2009, while the actual market price reached 22,000 per cylinder. 40% of that subsidy flows to upper-middle-class households who don't need it. The country imports 3/4 of its LPG supply. In 2023 alone, demand reached 8 million tons against only 2 million in domestic production, creating an import tab of 74 trillion rupiah. Without cash transfer programs during price hikes, poverty projections jump from a baseline of 9.54% to above 12%. Millions of street vendors, the backbone of urban food access, operate on razor-thin margins, where managerial transaction costs alone consume over 62% of their total costs, and they rely on informal networks of trust and solidarity just to stay open. The bullwhip effect. Every one of these shocks gets amplified through the supply chain by what economists call the bullwhip effect. A 20% bump in retail demand can transform into a 100% surge or more by the time the signal reaches farms. During the 2020 pandemic, food away from home spending collapsed 23%, while grocery sales jumped 29%, and the mismatch destroyed entire supply pipelines. Dairy cooperatives ordered farmers to dump millions of gallons of milk because processing plants built for bulk food service formats could not repackage for retail shelves. Cattle and hog slaughter rates fell to 65% of prior year volume, even as retail meat prices soared. Across the broader food sector, models project losses equal to nearly 30% of a year's profits over every decade, with severe disruptions arriving on average every 3.7 years. The path forward. Fixing this demands rebuilding the system from the kitchen outward. Commercial kitchens need hybrid energy setups, combining gas with induction, so that losing one fuel source doesn't trigger total shutdown. Governments need to treat cooking fuel as a national security priority. Indonesia's crude reserves cover only 25 days of consumption at 1.6 million barrels per day, and energy experts estimate that building a safer 70-day buffer would cost $22 billion. The country's pilot induction cooking programs in Bali and Surakarta already show that households can save 37,000 rupiah per month, and a full national transition could cut subsidy costs by 7 to 12 trillion rupiah every year. The obstacle is upfront cost, which means low-income families need targeted subsidies for stoves, cookware, and meter upgrades to make the switch. Until food systems break free from their dependence on a single, geopolitically fragile source of fossil fuel, the simple act of cooking a meal will remain at the mercy of forces no household can control. And each time the gas runs out, it will not only be kitchens that go dark, but the livelihoods, the nutrition, and the long-term health of whole generations that pay the price.